Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here again today, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day in Minnesota. We're so grateful for the cultural richness that our 11 tribal nations bring to our lives here in the state. The meeting is being held remotely due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021 allows us to hold remote meetings during the pandemic because an in-person meeting or meeting conducted under Section 13D.02 is not practical or prudent because of a health pandemic or an emergency declared under Chapter 12. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jeff Ettinger.
Oh, what an intro. Thank you, Jody. Welcome everyone from the council. For starters, we want to thank everyone for suggesting topics and other voices that you wanted to hear. We had asked that everybody include those last week that wanted to add any topics, and so we processed those. Some of them are going to be addressed via providing added data or documents, but we have added a panel for our next meeting on October 18th that is reflective of the ideas. Specifically, we will be hearing from representatives of Indigenous people, for youth, and for frontline workers. Objective of the opening portion of the meeting today is to discuss priorities and values identified thus far by the council with the entities named in the executive order. And we have representatives from those that Jody will introduce here in a minute. We're hoping they will help us identify equitable economic growth opportunities. In addition to the panel, today we're going to have a presentation from Commissioners Harpstead and Grove of earlier work that they did on our proposals. And then we'll have our small group discussions to consider what we've heard from today's panel and the presentation. And then Paul's going to walk us through our existing roadmap of kind of the next few meetings as we get to the end of this sprint here of the first part of our mission. And specifically today, we're going to have a large group discussion about some proposed guiding principles for the group. So I'm going to turn it back over to Commissioner Harpstead to moderate our panel today and to introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. Governor's One Minnesota Council on Inclusion and Equity, Chris Taylor is our Chief Inclusion Officer in the Governor's Office. The Governor's Community Council on Inclusion and Equity, Crystal Fairchild is our Deputy Inclusion Officer here in the administration. And our Children's Cabinet, Erin Bailey's here, Assistant Commissioner and Executive Director of the Governor's Children's Cabinet. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and share just a bit about the role of their council or cabinet. Chris, I don't see you on my screen. Are you there?
Chris isn't on the phone call.
Yeah, he's coming on just a minute. He was delayed with the governor's office, so should be on in just a moment.
Off to you, Crystal.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you so much for inviting our office to join you all. Just as Commissioner Harpstead mentioned, we are the Office of Inclusion, myself and Chris. He'll introduce himself when he joins us. I'm the Deputy Chief Inclusion Officer, and also the chair for the Governor's Community Council on Equity and Inclusion. That chair, in that position, I'm more or less responsible for the management and the operations of the council and ensuring that they have the right decision-making tools and are ready to support how we're going to figure out how to make those equitable outcomes and decision-making within the council moving forward. So that's my role.
Can we get everybody to, I can't, there's a lot of wrestling going on. Can we get people to mute? Thanks.
So yeah, that's all I had to say. So I can give it over to Erin.
Thank you, Crystal. Erin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's amazing to be here with all of you. My name's Erin Bailey, and I have the privilege of serving, as the commissioner said, as the executive director of the Governor's Children's Cabinet. The Children's Cabinet in Minnesota was put in statute here in around the early 90s. We created the body at around the same time as around 35 other states around the country created a children's cabinet. And really sort of, if you ask the National Governors Association or experts across the country about what is the sweet spot of an interagency convening like this, it's around aligning people, data, money, and policy around children, that we have state agencies that are built around responding to systems. And the goal of an interagency convening is to try to help those systems talk to each other and coordinate around people and systems, and to be able to kind of hold the big tent conversation and visioning around what should be different for children and families. In Minnesota, our children's cabinet remained dormant for around 20 years. There was individuals in the role, but it didn't sort of have a large footprint until around 2011, which many folks know. Mayor Carter stepped into the role, and there was a heavy early childhood focus and childcare focus to that work. When the governor and lieutenant governor took office, and I stepped into the role in sort of the first quarter of their term, we took a big step back and said, all right, how are folks using these bodies across the country, and how can we make the biggest impact? And what is community telling us that we need? What is the accountability lever of a children's cabinet to really move work for kids and families? And one of the big pieces of feedback that we heard was going back to that mission that I described, and then really focusing on the who is being left behind: children and families of color, Indigenous kids and families, lower income kids and families, and that the metrics and policy solutions that we have in terms of positively impacting their lives is focusing on the whole family and lifting up kids and families together. And how do we look at our systems and structures across state government in order to do that? So when we relaunched, we created an executive order that added, our statute in Minnesota has 10 agencies a part of the cabinet. The governor added an additional 12 and felt strongly like once a quarter his commissioners can come around a table and talk about kids and families as a priority in the administration. And obviously some of our agencies are much more involved. So I'll just touch kind of briefly on that work. We are working across the enterprise in a variety of places. We have 5 public-facing priorities. Those are in infant and parental health, specifically around kids and families of color and Indigenous kids, knowing we have really gut-wrenching disparities from the very beginning for Black moms and babies and Indigenous moms and babies as well. Around childcare and early education, which I'm guessing we'll talk a little bit more about today, mental health and well-being, housing, and educational opportunity. And then additionally, we have sort of a variety of governance structures to try to remove barriers for action in our state systems. I'll also just mention briefly that Barty Wahi here from the Children's Defense Fund serves on our advisory council. We have an advisory council that helps to inform our work, and we try to keep kind of engagement and that ground presence of what we're hearing from community, sort of the driver of action that we are leveraging and pushing across the enterprise. And I'll stop there, and excited to sort of chat more throughout today. Thanks again.
Thank you, Erin. I think of our children's cabinet as keeping us all centered on the thing that you perhaps have heard the governor and lieutenant governor mention before, that they'd love to see Minnesota be the best state in the nation for children to grow up. So thank you for that. Chris is not with us still at this point, so I'm going to turn it right back to you, Erin. The children's cabinet's been in place for almost 3 years now, and what might you have to share in terms of insights and themes you're hearing in your work as it relates to the impact of the pandemic on the economy?
Yeah, one of the things that was just exciting for me to join all of you is a huge theme for us has been the close partnership that is needed with communities, with folks on the ground, organizations, in terms of how we best respond. So I look at Mr. Kashkari here and the research that the Federal Reserve has put out, and our relationship with them has allowed us to help develop some of the quick financial supports that we've been able to develop. That's put really Minnesota ahead of the curve across the country in terms of stabilizing the childcare market. And so I think that, just on that bucket, one of the really key priorities that I think about is that on the ground relationship. Commissioner Harpstead, your team, and the work with kids and families to support some of the flexibilities that were afforded in order to ensure that basic sort of economic stability of families was at the center, and knowing how important that is to our overall goals and to the work that all of you are doing. I would say that obviously COVID has highlighted the incredible need on childcare supports for families. And as we think about economic expansion, we heard really loud and clear that about a third of our healthcare workforce depended on childcare in order to respond to the pandemic. And so that is how and why we prioritize the supports that we did, and why I kind of touch on those relationships first. I think those direct relationships with providers were the reasons why we were able to be successful and build supply chains to get hand sanitizer when that's what it came down to, or getting cash into folks' pocket. And now it's really around testing. How do we make sure that testing access means that parents can continue to go to work? How we know that testing access can mean the difference between a provider being closed for an extra 3 days, for instance, which is cash in folks' pocket, whether or not they're either charging families for that time. Many providers are not, but some are, or it's workers, I'll say for my own provider, staff not getting paid when those classrooms are closed. And so that component in the response has just been really critically important. And we know that the childcare workforce is disproportionately women of color. And so that those strategies are just so closely tied to both those supporting of families, but as in a workforce itself, how we think about our values and succeeding. And I think that the pipeline and supports and way that we support those staff and heroes on the front line is another kind of place where we really we want to make sure that the learnings that we have from COVID and how much we depend is something that translates into action and investment for the workforce, and how important it is for the stability of our kids and families and economy and education moving forward.
Thanks so much, Erin. On the other end of the time scale, Crystal, the Governor's Council on Inclusion and Equity is a fairly new council. As I understand it, it actually replaces a couple of other things we had going during the pandemic, during the earlier height of the pandemic. And now it's intended to be an ongoing body that works with the governor to think about equity and inclusion across the state. Why don't you tell us what your thoughts are, insights and themes you're hearing as it relates to the impact of the pandemic on the economy?
Yeah, sure. So the intention for the Governor's Community Council is to leverage like all of the things has happened during the pandemic and before, and leverage those experiences and insights and looking at where the disparities and systemic racism and inequities that are impacting our state are. And so the council members are directly responsible for managing and implementing activities that would promote those equitable outcomes across the state. And so, like Commissioner Harpstead mentioned, we've only met twice thus far. And so we're kind of like on the same page as you all are in a sense. And we've only met twice, and we meet monthly. And so in those meetings, we've just kind of been level setting and looking at where do we start, and like looking at the state's impact across the agencies, and where those areas are, and what do we want to approach first, and how do we want to approach, what approach do we want to use, and just trying to figure out how do we build an equitable lens to get to this decision making and what that would look like. And that's where we kind of have been at and been grappling with since the start. And we started, I think at the end of August was our first meeting. And so we've met 2 times, and we meet monthly.
I appreciate you're still putting together kind of the process of how you're going to work together. Any themes coming up in terms of content?
Yeah, so the themes, some of the equity priority areas that we've kind of targeted or looked at is education, looking at racial impacts, and leading with race is I believe will be the priority as we move forward. And looking at education, and some of those things I've been hearing a lot of the impacts in education. So like the kids and children and families, and things of that nature. Some of the same things that I think that we hear. One thing that I also think that I've heard, aside from the community council, but within the communities, is community convening and the importance of convening community and having those difficult conversations and continuing them. And involving community in all of our decision-making processes, and the importance of that is something that I'm hopeful that the council will do as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I understand Chris Taylor's been able to join us now. Chris, if you want to start with just a few words about the One Minnesota Council on Inclusion and Equity and how that differs from the Governor's Community Council. And then head right into the question about insights and themes you're hearing as it relates to the impact of the pandemic on the economy. Chris Taylor.
Sure. Thank you all. I appreciate being here with you. Sorry I'm a little bit late. My name is Chris Taylor. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer for Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. In that role, I chair the One Minnesota Council on Inclusion and Equity. And that council is comprised of 13 appointed commissioners, but we invite all of the cabinet level commissioners to come to the meetings. The goals of the One Minnesota Council are really to embed equity into how state government operates. And so we really have kind of we have a lot of latitude in terms of what we can focus on, but we've really been focused more internally on shifting organizational culture, retention of staff, hiring. We want to take a look at infrastructure for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, these types of things, and really so more organizational development, organizational change type of activities with the council. We have a meeting tomorrow. Actually, we're wrapping up our first kind of round of subcommittees, in that we have focused on there's 2 that are ready to kind of report out, and 1 that's still doing a little bit of work. We've focused on leadership development, and so from 2 kind of perspectives, we've looked at how do we have more diverse representation in our leadership ranks, but then also what does inclusive leadership look like, and how do we start to kind of implement that as the standard for our leaders across the enterprise. We've also looked at kind of data and metrics and disaggregation, and really wanting to come to some consensus about how we're doing that across the enterprise, and really looking at how we develop a culture of reporting on our internal kind of diversity work, and making sure that we are clear on what we're measuring, but also how we're using that information to really better understand the experience of our employees, right? So our overarching goals around retention, we've set that retention 75% of newly hired employees over a 2-year stretch. We're about a year into that. We're currently on track to meet our goals with all of our groups that we've outlined, except veterans. We've outlined employees of color, employees with disabilities, Indigenous employees, and veterans. And so we're seeing an uptick in our retention. Our hiring numbers for BIPOC staff are around 20%. So we've kind of hit a goal that was there from the previous administration. And so there's quite a bit of work that we're doing. We use a equity framework to kind of frame all of our work. And with that, we've been working with the council and kind of designated staff that they have to implement equity change plans at all of the agencies, which they report to us quarterly on their progress, on their goals, and really lay out actions that they'll take over the next 3 months to kind of set the bar for what they need to do to continue to progress forward. So So we've been working, like I said, quite a bit internally. The other subcommittee that we have has to do with intercultural competence and how we assess our staff's intercultural competence, but more importantly, how we intentionally build and grow intercultural competence amongst our staff. So those are kind of the things that are right in front of us. In terms of themes emerging from the COVID crisis, I mean, I think for us in the One Minnesota Council context, we've been seeing a lot of burnout. We've been seeing questions about, policies and how they impact different groups internally with staff. But I think more importantly, for a while, I was chairing our community resiliency and response work group as it was for our response for COVID. And I think, the disaggregation of data there and just how that evolved and we got there, and we did have a dashboard through MDH that was reporting disaggregated data, but that was an evolution to get there, right? I think just understanding that all of these things are connected in an ecosystem, right? And so if more people of color are getting sick and more people of color have hourly kind of paying jobs, more people of color tend to have, either less insurance or no insurance, like these types of things, it's all cyclical and it's all connected. And that's kind of, I think, our approach with the One Minnesota Council, and I guess kind of our approach in the Office of Inclusion is this idea around systemic change, right? And it's not just a particular factor, it's a set of factors and how they're interrelated. And changing one may not disrupt the system, but when you look at how several of these factors are connected together and looking at creating disruptions in a number of different places, we can move the system, right? And so I guess that's, kind of the work that we're doing on the One Minnesota Council and how we're thinking about the change that we're trying to implement.
Thank you so much. Let's go back to Aaron. As you think about your work and the listening that you're doing in community, what one key area of investment would rise to the top of your priority list for, say, $1 billion of American Rescue Plan funding?
Well, as you can imagine, I don't have just one idea or answer to that question, but quite a bit. And I want to just briefly when I was sort of talking through like who are children in Minnesota, just briefly want to say we have about 1.3 million kids under the age of 18 in the state of Minnesota. Like I said, when we think of children's cabinet work, we think about investments in children, investments in parents and families as investments in children. And I think as you think about your opportunities to provide advice and recommendations, to really sort of take that to heart to the extent that you can, that as we think about poverty in Minnesota, and we have over 500,000 Minnesotans who still have family income levels below the official poverty threshold, which is about $25,000 in 2018, which is the number I have up higher, have up in front of my computer at this point. About 150,000 of those individuals in Minnesota are children. We know about 13%, a little under 13% of children in the state of Minnesota are living in poverty. And so I think as we think about economic expansion and opportunities to prioritize Minnesotans, thinking really about those opportunities to invest in families as an opportunity to care and invest in our young kids and families, in our children. Specifically related to ideas, and as we think about those one-time investments, as you can imagine, we're working hard across the enterprise with agencies to understand sort of what is coming up, what are they hearing from their various stakeholders, what do we need to remove barriers from or breathe oxygen into, and what new ideas need to be centered. There are two that I wanted to lift up here today, and I spoke about childcare, and I think that is obviously something that we need to be really centered on as we think about economic expansion, and specifically who is going to benefit from that. How do we make sure that we're prioritizing kids and families in poverty in that work, and thinking about the workforce itself as a major investment, as a place where we need really strong investment in diversifying the workforce and in quality caretakers. I also just wanted to mention we have lots of research around early intervention in kids and families and increased economic self-sufficiency of families. One of the most notable benefits of early intervention, specifically through our home visiting services. And so there are opportunities and proposals that have been lifted up specifically around diversifying our home visiting workforce and reaching our each and every family as early as we possibly can. And so that's another issue area that I would want to lift up. And lastly, less specific to a specific issue, I just want to say that the Children's Cabinet, both our advisory council and our commissioners, want to be a front door and an open door for this council. So if there are additional questions or interactions between policy ideas that might be of consideration as you're moving forward, that consider us a resource to help go and get that answer and figure it out across the enterprise as you move forward as well.
Thank you, Erin. And as you know, in the last session, there was a lot of hard work to increase child care assistance program funding for the first time in many years, still leaving us well below the national average in how that program is funded. So it's not off the table for this council to say, let's double that, or let's double down on something that was invested in last year. We can always keep going on some of the things that have already been accomplished. Thank you, Erin. Crystal, do you have a thought about a key area of investment that would rise to the top of your list for American Rescue Plan funding, given your listening and across your job and anything that you do?
Yeah, for American Rescue funding, I think embedding an equity lens into the process would be something I would think that should rise to the top of priorities. And embedding that in the process. I know that the website of the portal had a few questions in it, but nothing really that embedded or had any consideration around disproportionality and inequities as it relates to funding. And so I just, I would urge you or urge whomever that's implementing to embed an equity lens in the process or criteria for equity early on.
Thank you very much. And Chris, from all of the work that you do, any thoughts about ways to invest the American Rescue Plan dollars?
So I'm at a loss for specific issues because I think the issues are out there, and we talk about the issues a lot. Like we talked about education and early childhood funding, and police reform and all of these. I think when I think about the opportunity with this money, being that it's one-time funding, like what process changes can be made that this money could help support, that then becomes the new norm or the default by which we practice moving forward, right? And then that change becomes sustainable, right? And so we have social systems and processes and these types of things that, in my opinion, skew towards the dominant culture, right? And so how do we disrupt that? And whether that's an equity lens like Crystal was talking about, or, really just, I think, understanding, so if a particular agency is still using a process that they developed 10, 15 years ago, is it still working for us in our current climate? And how can we fund either some research or some capacity to really kind of slow down and interrupt that process and create something that does achieve more equitable outcomes? And so I'm sorry, it's not a real specific answer, but I guess when I'm approaching this work, that, like I said, that systemic piece is really what I'm trying to focus on. And so how do we interrupt business as usual? And is there an opportunity to use this funding or part of this funding anyways, to really dig in and understand those systems that are skewed and kind of right those wrongs?
Thank you, Chris. And the One Minnesota Council, of course, primarily focused inside state government, but your thought is if we could use some investment in it now to change hearts and minds and processes and procedures in state government, it would have a lasting impact beyond this temporary money.
Yeah, I mean, so the through line in much of the work that we do as state government is the state employees and who is doing the work. And as we diversify the perspective, as we build the skills to recognize equity and bridge cultural difference and these types of things, absolutely. And so if there's opportunities to fund kind of that shift in habits of mind for our state workforce, I think that would be where a lot of that process change could really come from. And we could operate on principles of equity rather than kind of operating on our default ways that we've worked for a while.
Thank you. And I know, Chris and Crystal, you have the intention of bringing the community council together with the internal One Minnesota Council. And so as you do that, if you have any other thoughts about how we could be looking at the impact of the pandemic on the economy from your conversations, please keep us posted.
And Commissioner, could I just, so there's a question in the chat and two that are kind of related. And yes, we are working on procurement, and we're also working on equity in our grant making. And so there's two initiatives that are kind of spearheaded by the Department of Admin that are underway, because we know that as we allocate money out, equity in that process can make a big difference as well.
And I know the last time we looked at the data, we had made some real strides in procurement, changing the procurement processes in the state. I think we have longer to go in changing the grant making possibilities. But we have an awful lot of grant money right now where we could make a difference with that. So hopefully we'll see that dial turn as well. We have some time if people now on the council have questions of our three panelists today.
Well, better use a little hand thing.
Paul's waving his hand.
Hello, Paul, waving your hand. Go ahead.
That's fine.
You're muted, Paul.
Paul, you're on mute. Paul, you're on mute.
Paul, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Okay, we all say that every day.
I'm supposed to ask questions, but Chris is chairing, so I can ask at least one question. Chris Taylor, thank you for the comment on procurement. And I mean, a couple of years ago, I remember being at a forum. I mean, the figures on procurement for the state of Minnesota were abysmally low. I mean, like 1% of all procurement dollars were going to, I can't remember if it was to Black entrepreneurs or to entrepreneurs of color, period. It is, and Jody, I'm glad to hear that there have been changes in procurement systems. Is there any tracking on any kind of progress in actual awards? Because that is a huge movement, and it relates very much to what we've been talking in the council about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial opportunities for BIPOC entrepreneurs in particular. So I'm wondering, is there any tracking of that, of actual dollars spent?
Yes, and I know they hit a milestone this year. Commissioner Roberts Davis, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Commissioner Roberts Davis has those numbers for sure, and they are tracking. And what I would say, having been part of conversations about this, that we're both internal and community folks, we've made progress. There's still room for improvement, right? And I don't know that we're we are where the community wants us to be right now, or various communities would like us to be, but we have made significant progress. And so while progress has been made, I don't think it would be something where, you know, it's like, well, that's on track and we don't really have to pay attention to that. I think it would still be something that could use a boost or could use, more support or continued support moving it forward, continuing the success that's already been happening over the last several years.
So perhaps the simple math is that it's not hard to do significant improvement on abysmal, Paul. But at least we're not ignoring it, and it is moving now. And Alice Davis is doing a great job of digging into it. Other questions from the council members to our panelists?
I think Brett had his hand up at one point. Are you still interested, Brett?
Yeah, I was just curious as to the best way to route the funds, and this could be to any of the panelists, but you know, if you were receiving funds, what's the best way for those funds to come into the various organizations? I mean, is it a direct infusion? Is it just curious as to how that would work?
For example, in childcare, Erin?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Brett, it would depend on what the purpose of the funds or the strategy is about. I mean, I think one of the advantages of an interagency convening is being able to start with that outcome-oriented question of what's the goal that we're trying to achieve, and then figuring out where is the right place for that to live versus starting from our structures as the first step. But yeah, I think related to childcare, for instance, it could even depend what that particular strategy is in terms of where. But I think your point also gets at how do we think about making sure that we have investments and resources that are flowing to people and not just to the systems that are serving people, but really keeping the family at the center. And I'll just say, I think we've done a really good job at the former, and I think there's some work to do in making sure really we know that, like I said, the best investment as a kid is an investment in their parent. And we know disproportionate impacts on parents and women related to COVID specifically. So look, depending on what that strategy would be, really trying to look at how do we get more resources and supports directly to people.
Thank you.
Barty Wahi, question, comment?
Yeah, I'm so glad to see everybody. I guess my question would be to Crystal, Chris, Erin. So we've talked a little bit, I mean, all of you are sort of overseeing, or at least sort of addressing or thinking about the system designed to move money out, right? And there's a reason why the system operates the way that it does. And so I'm curious around, like, how do we think, like, as a lot of money is going to be moving out the door, right? There's something about, and I'm not sort of, it's like pinging in my brain like a pinball, but there's something about the mental models about who gets to have resources, who gets to define the problem, there, you know, how money moves, right? And I'm curious about, like, as these things are going out the door, as we are thinking about them, like, what do you think you can do from an interagency perspective around addressing some of the mental models that inform how procurement happens, how grant making happens within the state agency enterprise, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions around deservingness, around risk and liability that go into the way in which the state apparatus moves, right? And I'm curious, like, what do you think needs to happen in order for money? Crystal talked about, like, there needs to be an equity lens, but there also needs to be an equity process, because equitable outcomes only come from equitable process. And if equitable process has never actually been inherent in the system, it will be difficult to get there. So I'm curious, like, how do we make better moves? And as we are thinking about recommendations for this money to go out, how could that potentially live there? So, sorry, that was a big one. Feel free to be like, I'll catch you later at a different time, Barty, or whatever, but just, or put it in the chat, but just curious about how we can maybe be thinking about that.
Well, I think, go ahead, Erin.
I'll just say, I mean, specifically to our work, one of the things that we are about to launch is a children's fiscal map, which is the first time that Minnesota has done this at a statewide, which essentially tags our state spending related to what are the outcomes that we are hoping to achieve. Is it education? Is it family and community? And it's tied to Annie Casey Kids Count data, which Barty knows well. And then what are the categories of intervention? Is it prevention? Is it education? Is it rehabilitation? Is it intervention? And I think what we believe that will tell us in the short term is maybe less impactful than over the long term. How do we make sure that our state systems are owning that coordination of data to provide Minnesotans and the community with that analysis based on the person versus based on our system? And what I'll say is there are some clear gaps that we see when we look at it that way, and some where we're spending more money versus less. And so I think, part of what I've heard the governor and first lady say is we measure what we care about. And so we need to be more closely tied to making sure that we're measuring and being transparent around so that we have that accountability piece that you're talking about specifically related to the work that I do. But Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
No, I was going to say something similar. I think it's, as decisions are being made about where the money is going to go, are folks being required to talk about what is going to be the equity impact that they have with using the money and being very clear and specific. I've seen situations where it's like, essentially like, yeah, we're going to create equity, but how? What are the specifics, and how are you going to measure that, and how are you going to be accountable to that? And I think that, oftentimes, if in a grant process or whatever, we're not asked the question, we're not necessarily required to put that in our thinking process or beholden to having outlined something that we're saying we're going to do. And so, I think when Crystal, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Crystal, but when she was talking about an equity lens, like, is there an equity kind of framework or a tool that we're using to develop the application process, to embed in the review process, to, these types of things? Are we asking people, how are you going to be accountable to BIPOC communities or other communities specifically? And then allocate the funds. And then when we check back in with them, are they doing what they said, right?
Good, thank you. We've got a couple other questions I'd like to tuck in before we're done here. Scott Burns, you were next.
Well, just a really great set of discussions and observations. I wonder, one thing I just would love to have raised up to this group would be sort of the concept of shovel-ready programs. And I think the commissioner made the comment earlier, we've already invested in childcare, but could we double it? Where are there programs where a significant increase could make a big difference? And I just really hope we can get that kind of feedback in. And along those lines, it would be wonderful if there were bottlenecks in delivery of service at the state where we could make one-time investments that would dramatically improve delivery. And we haven't talked a lot about that because we're thinking bigger, but pragmatically, one-time improvements in delivery could benefit our recipients of services for the long haul. So those are my two thoughts.
Good, thank you.
One other thing, Scott, that we've been talking about internally, and it's something that should have dawned on me a long time ago, but it didn't, was just translating materials into people's most comfortable language, right? And so I try to think about navigating state government in a second language or a third language or whatever. It's hard enough to do in my native language, trying to do it, right? So even something like that, and I know that there's conversation internally right now about translating, but we only have a certain amount of resources to do that. So when you said delivery of service, I thought about even just communication or awareness that services exist for folks, or easier instructions for them to internalize on how to utilize those could be helpful as well.
Thank you, Chris. And one thing we learned in the last year is when you translate a page and the temporary money ends, the translated page is still there. So it's a good use of temporary money. Thank you. Joe Fowler, you had a comment in the chat and you had your hand up too. What you got?
this is for Erin if it's in her wheelhouse, but I'm just wondering, what you have seen in regards to COVID's effect on access to childcare. I recently had a kid and I had a big smile on my face from seeing Neil's child on his lap there. And I'm fortunate, and so are my wife, in that, she can go part-time when going back outside of maternity leave. But I'm wondering how much it's affecting our workforce, and not necessarily whether it's the female portion or the male portion of the household, but somebody, if they don't have childcare or access to affordable childcare, and they go part-time or off shift so that they can manage their, having somebody around for their children, is there a lack of access to childcare? And I'm actually asking that because I don't really, I believe there is, but I don't know the answer to that because I've just recently come into that's where I'm going to be needing it. So, but when that happens, I think it has kind of that ripple effect, or what you want to say, maybe it's the butterfly effect. Everything affects everything downstream, because then you talked about 13%, I believe, of our citizens are below the poverty level. Well, if you just took part of that household income, or the ability to make household income, and took it down because they had to go off shift or part-time, so now you don't have two full incomes coming in to support a household, which in the past you didn't need to, but nowadays you certainly seem to, how that's having a ripple effect, if it is, and we have a lack of access to affordable childcare. I'm not, and affordable is the key word, because if you can't afford to pay $2,000 a month to have your kid in childcare, but that's what's available, well, that you might as well not have access to childcare, because it's the same difference at that point. So I'm just wondering, because I feel like there's a lot involved there. I don't know if that's something you deal with from the position you have in the children's cabinet or not.
Yeah, and we've been closely tracking related to COVID effects, and there's data and research that I can share. But I mean, the short answer is yes, access to affordable childcare, and specifically, it depends on the region how dramatic that gap is, and also that we have culturally appropriate and a diverse workforce in childcare is also a significant gap that we see. We have there's all kinds of national and local and some folks on the phone here whose organizations have led research in some of these areas that we could share as well, just to how that has impacted the economy. There's also the distinction between how school being in online or distance learning has impacted, where it might not be a childcare component, but what was happening to our older kids and families and parents leaving the workforce. But certainly there is a lack of access to affordable childcare in the state and across the country that impacts parents' ability to go to work. I'll say in Minnesota, we're really proud of the way that we wrapped around and invested really early in the industry to try to help as many, we were in a huge deficit before COVID, and to try to help support as many providers as we could. That doesn't mean that is accessible to every kid and family, and the cost is far too great. But there's a lot of work that needs to continue to happen. The industry is struggling with workforce shortages. That is the topic of the day, like many industries, but really, 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 really struggling with a lack of staff at this point. And that is leading to reduced hours, increased costs. There's really no place for a childcare business to shift its cost other than cutting wages on an already low income workforce or raising rates on families. And so that business model obviously requires, I would argue, some much more significant investments from other places in order to make that work and ensure that we have affordable access and high quality access across the state and country. But lots more research we could share on that.
I think we probably need to go ahead and thank Crystal and Chris and Erin for their great participation today, and the council will definitely consider your thoughts as we move forward.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're going to move on to the next segment of our business of the council today. Commissioner Harpstead, this is her third time already going to be on the docket today. It was a busy day for Jody, but she'll be joined by Commissioner Grove. They're going to have a presentation on work that they did during the spring related to the ARP funds. We're going to try to go for maybe around 15 minutes of presentation, and then definitely have time for Q&A from the council. And just want to, I'm sure they're going to have the same sort of preamble to it, but just to give the council perspective. I mean, these are ideas that they came up with back during the course of last year. We thought that they would be helpful for the council to see what ideas are out there, but this is not like, oh, here's what the state wants you to recommend, and this is what you're going to get given to ultimately decide on. So with that, I will turn it over to Jody and Steve.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I'll get us kicked off. Hey, everybody. Good to see you all. Great discussion to kick us off today. Really wonderful panel. Thanks to our panelists for joining. Jeff, you summed it up really well. You know, ever since the ARPA was signed by President Biden on March 11th of this year, which, boy, seems like forever ago, but was actually still in 2021. We have been, as you can imagine, taking dozens, if not hundreds, of stakeholder meetings across the state with a variety of groups to hear how they think this money should be spent. And in that process, Jody and I and others were cataloging those ideas that all fit into this idea of building an equitable economy moving forward. And when it became clear that the next $1 billion of ARP would be spent in the manner that we all know it will be now in negotiation with the legislature, the idea of this council came together really as a critical, more strategic, forward-leaning planning process to get that feedback from the best and the brightest in our state to give us a sense for how we should proceed. So really, this has all been part of a process of developing the best insights that we can inside of the administration. We felt it would be helpful at this point in our journey to share what we have collected so far. Nick, you can go to the next slide just to give you some context. These are ideas. This is not a strategic plan we're presenting you with. These have not been, sort of sanctioned by the governor's office or any of us as the direction that we should take. If you total up the amount of money you're about to see referenced in this deck, it far exceeds the total allocation, which should just give you some idea that this is a list of ideas. But we did go back through it in preparation for this meeting and highlight what was funded and was not funded in that first $1 billion of ARP, just to give you a sense for kind of where this is going. And I'll be honest, this is a light touch. Jody and I are going to run through about 30, 35 ideas here. We will not get into depth in 15 minutes on any of them. We certainly could go further if you like. But we wanted to give you a flavor for what that conversation has been like so far. And we can obviously go deeper in any given area if it's useful, but felt this would be good context for the path ahead. So if you go to the next slide, Nick, I think the framework we put together on this was kind of on a spectrum of people who are still just really suffering from the pandemic and need immediate help, to those who will sort of need to get dealt into the economy as they get up on their feet, and then to sort of job creation, reskilling, transforming a system for growth for longer term benefit, promoting our state to the world. And then there's a specific idea around a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Jody will share later. But we saw this as kind of a spectrum of need, and that's why kind of DHS and DEED came together. DHS covered kind of the first area of the spectrum, and then DEED kind of picks up from there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jody to get us started on sort of these first few pillars, and then I'll pick up on job creation from there. So Jody, over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute, Jody.
I'm on mute. No, I'm not. Thank you. Preventing further harm from the pandemic. Of course, we were still in a pandemic when these ideas came forward. I should share right away that the governor, as you know, received funds from the legislature to continue to deal with the pandemic, $500 million to continue deal over the last year with the pandemic itself. So these ideas moved from equitable economy to the governor's special budget. And so he continues today to fund important necessities for people that are trying to establish housing stabilization and food security. So these kind of came off of our chart with the shift of that money to the governor to use for these purposes. So why don't we go to the next slide? In terms of dealing people into the economy, this first set of ideas all came about as cash benefits for Minnesotans living in deep poverty. Marcus Owens, I saw your comment about can we eliminate some of the bureaucracy and just give money to people who need it. And there's a lot of research across the country, the third line down on universal benefits grants that just give money to people who need it, get out of the way, and don't embed all kinds of requirements in it. None of these ideas on this list were funded. However, we did end up getting a cost of living increase for our MFIP, Minnesota Family Investment Program. And we did get some cash payments to MFIP families. And we'll be studying the result of that. What happens when you just give people in poverty cash, get out of their way, they know how to spend it. Let's see how that works. Next slide. This was a major piece of work that did get into the state budget. There was a universal bipartisan support for supporting the home care industry. So PCA agency relief, increased funding for PCA providers and increased wages for PCAs, increased funding for people using PCA and other services, and an age-friendly Minnesota Commission for the state of Minnesota. Next slide, thanks. Capacity building grants to particularly BIPOC, culturally specific LGBTQIA and greater Minnesota providers. As you mentioned, Barty, if you leave things the way they are, the same providers always tend to get the money. They have over the years been able to use their funding to hire advocates who get more money, who get more advocates, who get more money. And there's no surprise that we have disparities in Minnesota. So this was money set aside specifically for capacity building grants to the providers that don't always get the money. I should say that along our path, as we were looking at fiscal recovery funds, the same funds that this council is looking at, we suddenly got $686 million in Minnesota for home and community-based services. And so the last slide and this slide were shifted to the home and community-based funds and don't come out of the fiscal recovery funds that you're talking about. So along the way, the federal government came through with funds for lots of different spaces, including this one. Next slide. You'll see later there was a proposal from DEED for broadband access. And then we said, and we know there are people in isolated spaces in Minnesota who don't have the mobile devices or the internet connections to access such broadband. And so we got some money funded for that. And then we had looked at an idea for investing in greater telemedicine behavioral health, which was a great boon during COVID. Behavioral health moved forward dramatically during COVID because it went telemedicine. And more investments in that can just make that go further. Next slide. You may have remembered that the fiscal recovery funds allowed for specific infrastructure investments. So we've tried to go for some of our own. Our direct care and treatment services across the state are in need of water and sewer upgrades, et cetera, and other systems improvements. These did not get funded. Next slide. And then there was a Back to Better plan at DHS that we were going to have to go back and recertify people across the state for healthcare plans and other benefits. And this money was funded. And so we were able to get that. So next slide. And I think it's back to you, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Jody. I see Juhi's note. Are people seeing the slides advance or most are? Okay.
I am.
Good. Well, next bucket, if you will, is about job creation. And of course, in an economic disruption, creating jobs is an imperative for an economy to grow. So there's a lot of ideas on how to best do that. The angel tax credit here comes in at one of the main ideas we heard a lot about. We think that this program is chronically oversubscribed. Tons of people want to use it. It runs out very quickly. It helps create startups that define the next chapter of our economy, and $20 million would right size it. I think we get about $5 million a year at this point. The Small Business Recovery Program is about grants delivered directly to businesses still struggling from the pandemic. We're actually putting into place $70 million on that even later this week with a lottery for small businesses coming out of DEED that will receive that money. So that did get funded. Launch Minnesota, a program that Ann Holder mentioned in her appearance a while back, got partially funded this last session, but we think a $10 million matching grant incentive there could go a long way to encouraging people to start companies in a state that does well once we start stuff, but is sometimes hesitant to get things up and going. We have a job creation programs around hiring people with disabilities. Firms that do that would be incentivized to do it. Broadband, I want to pause on for a second here because I think this has come up a decent number of times in this council, and it's a really important topic. Since it has been raised here, I've gone back to our broadband office and we've done some analysis. And I asked the team, you know, if we take the $70 million we got from the first tranche of ARP and make some assumptions about the federal dollars, what's the sort of amount we would need to finish the job, if you will, right? And that means getting to 100 megabytes down, 25 megabytes up by 2026. And we think that's around $150 million over the next 3 years. We can get into details there if that's helpful, but I wanted to share that because it has come up as a a kind of one-time funding opportunity that people were interested in. Clean water is another thing our agency deals with a lot, and we could easily put $100 million straight into Public Facilities Authority at our state government to make clean water available across the state. Huge for economic development. That was not funded in the last session. Next slide. So one of our most popular programs in state government is the Redevelopment Infrastructure Program. This redevelops land in primarily greater Minnesota for economic development. We could easily get $20 million out there to help smaller towns get up and running with economic development projects. There's some energy programs on this list too, in terms of transforming our grid for energy transition, and making sure that when rebuilding happens in areas such as those struck by civil unrest, it happens in a green manner. Some of those were partially funded this last session, which is good. There's some capital investment ideas on helping new banks, particularly those started by BIPOC leaders, get up and running. You saw the news of the first ever Black-owned bank, First Independence, coming to the Twin Cities soon, which we're very excited about. We weren't a part of that deal, obviously, but we think state government could play more of a role here to expand such initiatives, so that's on the list. You see the Energy Transition Incentive Program. This is coming out of an office that we formed at DEED to help communities that are shuttering coal plants transition to what's next. And so a fund to help them do that could be really helpful. And then you talk about productivity, you talk about workforce shortage, automation's always a part of that conversation. We've got a couple of ideas brewing there on automation loan programs that we think could significantly accelerate, particularly small manufacturers being able to automate quickly. None of those were funded in the first tranche of ARP. Next slide. The next sort of bucket was on reskilling, and this is that we've talked workforce almost every one of these meetings of the council. There's a mismatch in today's labor market in Minnesota and across the country, and so this idea of opportunities to reskill people for the jobs of the future is top of mind for a lot of the stakeholder groups we've talked with in our conversations at DEED. And so one of those things is just to expand a very popular existing program called the Job Training Incentive Program, where we match nonprofits with businesses such that there's a job at the end of the training program, so there's nothing left to guess, and you train people a lot more quickly into those roles. We're very bullish on this program. We think it operates at around, I think, $750K right now. You could times it by 10 and do a whole lot more work with that program. You could probably tweak it a little bit too for modern conditions. So that we're very eager on. We were able to fund a record amount of money for just general workforce development for BIPOC communities at $74 million this last session. Tech jobs is something that we're leaning into heavily, both given their long-term potential for the state and the fact that they pay way more than the average job in the state, and they're hugely underrepresented by both BIPOC populations and women. We're piloting a program right now on this, DEED. It's about $1 million pilot. We'll see where it goes, but already tons of people are interested. We've got some good educational providers in the state. Going up to 50 million could just blow this out of the water and really transition our state's tech ecosystem in a way that was more equitable and more powerful. And then youth jobs has come up a lot in this conversation. We're piloting a couple of youth jobs programs right now, but DEED only spends around $5 million a year on youth jobs. I mean, compared to a $500 million plus budget, my land, we could spend a lot more. And I think there's a lot of energy and excitement around kind of a modern day civilian conservation corps for those who remember that old program from back in the day. What would that look like today? We think 25 million could do a really exciting thing there. We've funded a couple of pilots, but not fully. Next slide. So remaining on the reskilling focus, some good ideas here on empowering people with disabilities for grants to help those with mental illness survive in the workplace. That's a theme that has definitely come up in this council throughout the past several meetings. We have launched an Office for New Americans at DEED focused on building bridges to immigrant and refugee communities. It's going well, but it's funded by a grant, so we would love to substantiate that. There is an on-the-job training incentive program here, again, focused on BIPOC and women that's powerful. We funded partially this last session, as did we were able to fund this workforce stabilization grant program that helps those who need to go back to school to finish off a community college degree do that and therefore get a credential and advance faster. So that did get funded. Dual training grants, a great program that Commissioner Robinson and her team run, is one of those programs, kind of like Angel Tax Credit, where everybody wants it. It's a great program. We just don't fund it enough, and so you could put a lot more money into that program and make it really, really sing. Next slide. So the last kind of bucket, or no, sorry, second to last bucket here is transforming our systems for growth. We've talked a lot about the fact that this is one-time funding that we're looking at, right? And what could you do that once you did it would just pay off again and again and again and again from the systematic level, from the process level? Candidly, these things are less like exciting on a billboard, and they're not money straight into the hands of people. They're more about government being more effective. So just that caveat aside, they would be incredibly powerful for us in terms of service delivery. One of those is just strengthening our business support network that helps us get money out to communities of color through funding. And so this is like technical assistance dollars. This is dollars to do trainings for community lenders and organizations. We funded this partially last session with a record amount of money, but you could certainly scale that up a lot more. Another is, frankly, digital infrastructure for a workforce. We sit on top of a system that was created basically in the 1980s. It's a bunch of brick and mortar buildings across the state, these career force centers. You walk into them in person, you sit down with a job counselor. It's a very passive model, and it's built in a pre-internet age. And if you want to have kind of a chuckle on state government websites, go to minnesotaworks.net, which is our state's job bank site that we run here at DEED. It looks like it was built, I don't know, maybe in like 1997. It is really old school and it needs to be updated. There's no question. And so there's these like pretty significant things you could do to transform the digital infrastructure by which the state of Minnesota helps people find jobs, especially those who are having trouble finding jobs, that could really just totally revolutionize how we do workforce development in the state. So that's one that was not funded, but that we continue to hear about and raise. There's a digital one-stop for small businesses. This idea that a small business that comes into government should have the same kind of concierge-like experience that a big business should get. So that's on the list here. And then we did get some great money for childcare last session, but building a standalone office is one that remains on the list. And then lastly, on the next slide, you'll see some ideas just on promoting our state. And I think you'll hear more from our agency on this in the coming months, because we are developing kind of a new platform for how we do outreach to site selectors and talent who might want to move here and what have you. But Minnesota has not traditionally done a lot of marketing, other than Explore Minnesota, which is for tourism. But man, at a time when we need workers and when workforce shortages are there and the competition between states is high, we kind of can't afford to keep ignoring the fact that we need to promote Minnesota to the right audiences around the world, and especially after the kind of year that we've had the last 2 years. So there's some ideas in here on marketing to that end, both for job creation and for tourism. So I'll pause there, turn to Jody for the last idea, and then we'd love to take questions.
At our last meeting last week, I heard the question come up that if we spend all this temporary money and we have an equity disparities problem in Minnesota today, when we're done, will we have made a dent in our disparities? And we heard that loud and clear last spring in our listening sessions. We listened to the folks from the People of Color Indigenous Caucus in the legislature, the House Select Committee on Racial Justice. We talked to the Minnesota Council of Churches that's working on this kind of an effort, and our own internal strategic anti-racism team. The idea that we would stand up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Minnesota, an examination of systemic racism in our state with recommendations to move the needle. The idea that came out of DHS was first to transform DHS itself, and then museum and public art installations for public education, street sign changes, school curriculum, and potentially reparations or land return. So we just continue to leave this idea on the list for your consideration. It didn't fall into any of the other buckets that came along to fund things last year, and so here it stands today. I just want to end our presentation by telling you a couple things. One is that when all was said and done, I asked our team to add up what did get funded in last year's session, and it was $500 million of equitable economy efforts. So we should take just a moment to celebrate that those are already in the state budget, done, happening. We're standing up the implementation of those now. And so you don't have to feel like this council has to have all the ideas, because some of them are already up and running. And they were funded by this home and community-based money, childcare money, mental health money, and didn't touch the fiscal recovery funds, which you still have to make recommendations about. Also suggesting that we will send this slide presentation to you, and if you want to print it or something and start scribbling on it, writing ideas of your own on it, we have a sense that your output as a council might look a lot like this slideshow. So if you have a chance to circle things in here that you like or that you might want to add funding to, and then start using that same document to scribble your own ideas as we go, that would help us to build the actual recommendations of this council. So have fun with that and see what other ideas you have. Since we did this listening mostly last spring and over the course of the summer, we have different issues now. The workforce shortage is much more dramatic for us, and we've learned a lot coming through COVID. And so now we're eager to hear what you have to say about the same topics that we were addressing last spring. So that is it. And Jeff, you can take the questions.
Yeah, so I mean, we're also going to break out in a few minutes to our small groups and really have a chance to talk over what we heard and start identifying themes and priorities for the council, some of which you might have gotten from that deck, some of which you might have gotten from the speakers. But if you have specific questions for Jody or Steve about what you just saw, let's focus on that right now, and then we'll go into our breakouts. Neil, please.
Yeah, this is Brett Carter. I was just going to say that as you talk about economic development and the marketing of Minnesota, I will tell you that we have a very high interest at Excel in participating in that, helping with that. And I can imagine that there would be other companies that would want to do that as well, but we actually hold funds aside for economic development. So if there's some partnerships that could happen there, love to have that conversation.
Thanks, Brett.
Neil?
Thanks, and thanks for accommodating my son. We are fortunate we have access to childcare, and the center is closed today, so my wife and I are juggling our children. So thanks for that. This question is, and by the way, thank you for the presentation you just made. I thought that was actually very helpful to see all of those ideas in one place. So that was a great contribution. Steve, I guess a question for you. Did you see that article? I can't remember the gentleman's name. I saw it on Twitter. Tawana Black sent it around about an African-American entrepreneur, tech entrepreneur in St. Paul. And his tech company is having success. And he finally just said, I'm fed up with it. I can't, my family and I cannot endure living in Minnesota anymore because of the culture of Minnesota and how unwelcoming it is for an African-American. And you know where he moved? He moved to Texas. I mean, so just pause and let that sink in for a second. He said, Minnesota's unwelcoming. I'm going to move to Texas for a better environment. You know, maybe the last slide, Jody, that you showed touched on this, but I mean, if we did all the programs, Steve, that you listed there, but the culture is still so fundamentally unwelcoming for people of color and African Americans in particular, are any of those programs going to make a difference?
Yeah. I mean, it's a rhetorical, it's, I think, a question we should all just sit with. But you're right. I mean, I know Clarence well, and it was a loss to the community when he left. And I know Scott and others know him very well, too. And that's a challenge. There's no question. And, you know, I think culture and who we are as a state has been a part of this conversation in this council from the beginning. I'll tell you, as we have built out a campaign that I can share with all of you, if you're interested in the next few weeks, of what it means to promote Minnesota to the world, we've kind of settled on this message around coming here to build what matters, because this is the kind of state where people build really purposeful companies. But in talking to a lot of corporate stakeholders across the ecosystem and other leaders and DI leaders and Tawana and others too, you can't do that without being honest about what's happened here the last few years and the kind of challenges our state faces. So I think you're going to see a pretty unique approach to, you know, promoting our economy and talking about growth that is honest about the past few years that we've had and shows examples of people trying to change it and doesn't run away from that as a factor. But there's some deeper work to be done, to your point. And I think that's you're asking the right question for this group to consider as we go forward.
Other questions of the two commissioners before we break out?
So a question in the chat about the difference between Greater Minnesota's work and your notion, Steve, of marketing efforts by the state.
Yeah, so I think most folks here are familiar with Greater MSP. It's the organization that runs sort of economic development, marketing, and messaging and outreach for just the Twin Cities metro area. Private organization funded by a partnership of corporate leaders. We're obviously indeed on the hook for the whole state. And I'll be honest, like our agency hasn't done a lot of like statewide marketing for Minnesota in the past. And we've decided to make it a priority because we feel like now is the moment with the competitive landscape as it is, with the last few years that we've had as a state, to really go big here. I will say that like government isn't by its nature an expert in marketing. And so to Brett's point on others partnering with us and taking that message forward in your own ways and allowing us to help you with kind of the statewide message, but other partners taking this forward has to be critical to that effort. And we do think about it statewide. We don't just think about it in terms of the metro as we consider what that message needs to be. And so a lot of partnerships happening with different groups around Minnesota. There's a group we convene called the Minnesota Marketing Partnership. That's essentially every marketing org across the state that comes together, and they're very behind this campaign and want to help it succeed. And we're gonna have to work together on it, no question.
We have one more from Marcus, and then we'll go to our groups.
Thanks for the presentation. That was very helpful to see. Just question, I think about two things when we think about business development for BIPOC businesses and then for young people. For BIPOC, I kept hearing this idea around like the state, and this has been an issue for a long time, is like how do we improve procurement at the state level and at other local levels? Has there been any programs or anything that has been brought forth around improving or increasing the number of businesses that could even qualify in the procurement lanes in some of those programs that's specific to procuring for the state? So going direct to make sure that those investments actually produce the results we're looking at. So that's one area. And then young folks, just thinking about the young folks that we've been talking about, particularly those that are in low-income housing and households, their income a lot of times when they're working our families are dependent on it. So when we're thinking about these programs, are they, presented in a way that gives them opportunities and pathways, or is it just, a youth program that they get some experience and they move on? So just thinking about how we support young people, moving into entrepreneurship or moving into other career paths that actually produce some income for their families, because those families are dependent on those pieces.
Yeah, two great points, and I'll be brief in response because I think they're good questions for us all to consider. But on the BIPOC front, I think in terms of investments in these businesses is both technical assistance and it's capital, and that's critical to making this successful. And for young people, the pilot we're running right now does a little bit of wage subsidy on the front end because it helps incentivize firms to hire younger people they wouldn't otherwise do. So it's kind of like an augmented internship, if you will, and then it transitions into full-time work. Our tech job program does it for young people, and our tech job program for BIPOC, again, a pilot, so we'll see where it goes, both has targeted scholarships for folks into these programs and then provides some kind of early stage guidance. Because I think what the companies are telling us is we can get people to have a software degree, but if we have to train them up on the job fully, it takes a lot more energy, and then we start making biased decisions that don't help our industry. So we need a little help on that kind of on the job training component. So that's going to play into this too.
Very good. Let's go ahead and break the groups out, and then we'll bring everybody back at 3:30, and Paul will be leading the session at that point.
there?
But I think we're back.
It always does. So welcome back, everyone. Quick and good, intense discussion. And I actually, I think I created my own segue in that I was just finishing a point. So welcome back, everyone. So a couple things that we want to do with just our last half hour here is really kind of set ourselves up for what's coming in the upcoming meetings. And you've got some information in your packet there. One piece I wanted to go back to was just to review our charge, actually. And so again, next week on the 18th, we're going to have an additional session with some additional input. There we go. Yeah, so let me come back to this in a second. But we're going to have some additional input next week. We had a couple questions in the chat box about potential speakers. We tried to kind of incorporate what we heard out of the input from last week. So we're still working on that. So more to come on next week's meeting, but that really, first half of that is some additional perspective, information gathering. Second half of that meeting will be starting to dig into kind of what are we hearing, right? In this question of themes, priorities that, at least in my small group, we really started to dig into. We have to start prioritizing. We have to start focusing. The last 3-4 meetings here is going to be all about we've all been, kicking back and listening and asking some great questions. I think phenomenal input, actually. I've learned a ton. I think we all have, but we really need to dig into, okay, what's our set of recommendations for at least this initial stretch, this short-term piece. So just going back to our charge, we were really charged with what is it going to take to catalyze progress towards an equitable, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economy. That's a big charge, right? That second piece talks about reimagining our economic future and recommending policies and strategies for multiple sectors that will create and support shared economic prosperity. Big charge. Third element talks about how do we center workers in our rebuilding of the economy and further attacking poverty. Again, big charge. Fourth piece gets into what's required by November 15th, immediate actions that can be taken by the public, private, nonprofit sectors, policy changes and investments for potential enactment during next year's legislative session, including recommendations on how we might leverage these remaining ARPA dollars. And again, I think it's specifically the remaining $1.15 billion. So not an insignificant amount, and lots of work coming down that road. Second piece I want to talk about is just a little bit more, and do we have the diagram with the boxes that just kind of outline the upcoming meetings, just to see how this all fits? I'm not sure who I am asking that question to, but someone, you have that in your packet. Thank you, Jeff. So it's the 4 boxes, yeah, in your packet. Again, if you look at that, you'll see October 11th. Today we're going to start talking about guiding principles that will help us, I think, kind of start to narrow down on shorter term priorities. Next week, we start gathering ideas. We're going to talk about some mapping. The staff has been listening and I think doing a phenomenal job in note taking, but we're going to start just mapping out and sharing with you what we've heard from you, and just putting that back out in front of us in terms of themes, priorities, and then trying to start mapping that out against, again, my group thought that today's presentation by Jody and Steve was really helpful. And we might want to do some more of that, just understanding the context of what else is out there in terms of existing funding and or kind of what's being recommended or thought about elsewhere kind of in the system and in state government right now. But October 18th will be about additional input, mapping, starting kind of that gap analysis, you'll see then the 25th and the 1st are all about kind of narrowing down. We are going to be asking you to do some, oh yeah, there, thank you. We're going to be asking you to take some votes. Actually, we're going to do some voting. And the voting isn't, what's in or out. It's more about identifying consensus and identifying some ranking and some prioritizing. We'll do that in a few different iterations. We'll also continue to use the Jamboard as a way of kind of generating ideas and trying to get a sense of consensus. So over the next 3 meetings or so, we're going to dig into that in a much more intensive way, both in small groups as well as the large group. So that's a little bit, and you'll see November 1st is when we're supposed to get to our final recommendations. I can't remember if we have a meeting on the 8th is when we were talking about presenting to the governor, at least again, our first cut or our first shorter term set of recommendations. I know the governor's going to be on a trade mission shortly thereafter. So there may be some wiggle room at the very end of that schedule, but that's what we're aiming for. So tall order, heavy lifting by everybody, and I think it's going to be a good process. I want to go back to guiding principles, and we're going to share and again, this is based on primarily what we've heard from all of you. So how would we start to narrow down and focus? And well, some principles would be helpful. And this is what the staff and Jeff and I kind of came up with, again, very simply, as some principles to narrow down. One, what are recommendations that would use one-time dollars effectively? Secondly, does this recommendation or this idea center equity? Third, how does this idea, proposal, recommendation build on existing successes or momentum? How does it integrate or connect with other players? I like to think of this one as don't recreate the wheel. What else is out there that we can build on? Fourth, how is this idea, this recommendation, making progress towards more systemic change? So the question to the large group here for the next several minutes is, how do you feel about those principles? Are there other principles, again, that would help us narrow, prioritize, would be a lens that we would use to say, yeah, these 5 or 6 ideas specifically are the ones that we really think make a lot of sense. And I'm going to call on my small group member and pick on Penny Wheeler, who I thought had a really good suggestion in our small group. Penny, can I go to you first? And then
yeah, I'd be happy to. One thing is that I might blow up some of these a little bit, so using them effectively, I think long lasting, so a lasting impact there, advancing equity, but Neil, to your point, and an inclusive culture that we can build on. And we did talk about building on existing success, amplifying, successful things that actually have arisen from communities. So that was one thing. But I think, Paul, what you're asking me is that what are those things that we might invest in that have kind of cross-cutting capabilities? So I'll just use as an example, we talked about broadband last time that has, it affects workforce, it affects healthcare delivery, it affects educational opportunities, it affects, a lot of things. So are there initiatives that have, impact on multiple things was another one for consideration. So I think, Paul, that's the one you wanted me to call out as specifically.
Great, thanks. Neil?
Thank you. I think the list is great. I was going to add, my own words, similar comment to Penny's. I think this list is great, and then you rank order them and you say which ones do we think should have the biggest impact on the biggest part of society or helping the most people. Some way of just getting at the biggest impact, but I think, Penny, that's the point you were making. So anyway, I think this is a great list of principles.
Other thoughts? I can't, the presentation slides are up, so I can't see hands, so just speak up.
This is Tracy Tapany, and one thing I'm thinking about just with this idea of advancing equity, I like that, but I also think that our state, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, we are still resisting as a whole the idea of equity. I hear it in meetings that I attend all the time, and before we can even begin to advance equity, I think we have to somehow rally behind it or embrace it, or some kind of terminology like that before we will ever have a chance to advance, because there is a lot of resistance to even talking about equity.
So Tracy, can I push you a little bit on that and just say more? What would, for this group, for our recommendations, what would you want us to do with that principle, with that comment?
Maybe develop, I don't know, common language that becomes part of the state, the council about equity. I attend meetings where sometimes people even, they might say, well, we're okay as an organization to talk about diversity and inclusion, but we are not going to include equity in that. And so to me, the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, those concepts need to go together and move forward together. So I'm not entirely sure. I just think there's something about saying that we're going to advance it when I think we're struggling to even talk about it.
I think it's a really good point. So let me suggest one thing. I was part of a Council on Foundations task force that just did some principles and guiding recommendations for foundations. And one of the things that we did was we said, let's create, and the staff will kill me for this, but let's create a preamble that captures some of our passion and captures some of these comments that would kind of be a little bit of just a preface to some of these specific recommendations. So that's a good point, fair point. We'll come back to that and just think about what else might go into the principle itself. So I saw Barty, I think, again.
Okay, I kind of put it in the chat, but I guess I would just say that, I also think that there's something about, I think we need to sort of, at least, how do we hold, I can't make the whole world have a shared understanding of equity because that's too big, but I do think that there might be some time taken around how are we defining it, right? Because I too, Tracy, sit in those conversations, and the way that people are holding the issue of equity is not shared. And it never gets operationalized because we can't even come to agreement about what is it we mean, right? So I do think that there's something that we could be thinking about. I want advancing equity to be a principle, but I also think that we probably need to, as a council, dig in a little bit more deeply into that as well. So I just want to put that in the conversation. I don't know how to say this in a way that makes sense, so it's going to be real rambly, sorry. But I guess in addition to cross-cutting, and I think it gets to, Marcus put a really amazing insight in the chat about would folks we want to feel an impact feel it now and later. But I also think that when we think about an inclusive economy, I think I there is what that feels like at the household level. It's what it feels like at the community level. It's what it feels like at an industry level, whatever industry we're talking about, right? And we have to hold the complexity of that, which doesn't lend itself into what are the top 5 top 5 recommendations. But I hold the household level as a particularly important place for in the context of my work. But there's something about an inclusive economy at the multitude of levels that we are talking about it, and that's just the piece that I'm rambling on about. But that's all.
Great, Joe.
Mine's more of a question, and maybe it's kind of the way I think about it. Maybe it's a little bit of ignorance, so educate me if that's the case. But when I think about equity, inclusion, and diversity, I don't want to minimize diversity and inclusion, but I feel like if people have equity, it's equity of opportunity, and you can't guarantee the outcomes. But if you're saying, well, a person of color is not feeling welcome within, I'll just use the construction industry, and both people have the chance to get into the construction industry, you're not really giving them the same opportunity if they don't feel welcomed. So I think the equity to me, when I think about it, is trying to ensure that everybody has opportunities, and it's the same opportunity without the other barriers that come after, that first job offer or whatever that may be. Is it a simpler way to think of it? I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but when I think of equity, I think of diversity and inclusion in my own head, and trying to make sure that everybody of every gender and every race has an opportunity to do those things, and trying to clear those roadblocks so that everybody has an opportunity. I don't know that that's the right way to think about it, the wrong way or not. So I would actually ask anybody else who has some feedback on kind of the way my thought is.
Hey, Paul, would you be willing to share out loud what you did in the chat and just kind of expand on it? I'm intrigued by that, but
Which part there?
Either one. I mean, you have the thing about, do we use the word equity, or is there a better way to do it? And then even the one earlier, yeah.
Right. So just to the point I was trying to make in there is, like, oftentimes we use the word equity and we assume that everybody has the same definition. But if we start to use the actual, terms that we want to actually change or to make inclusive for everybody. So if it's, directing, resources or investment in folks that have been left out, if it's around ensuring that, all folks are included with the same information, opportunity, and access points to, the different investments. There's a lot of descriptive words or descriptive sentences that we can say without using the word equity that will encompass or embrace equity. Everything about equity that I always think about is just like, I go down to, Barty, you said it, like the individual level, like how is this person experiencing Minnesota? And then if that person's part of a community and that community has similar experiences, how do they experience it? And then you keep laddering up to making sure that whatever we're doing isn't just hitting the most common, but it hits the specific people you want to impact or include in all of this.
Thanks.
Great points. Great points. Other thoughts?
I was going to add, kind of along the same lines as Marcus, about perhaps discussing geographic regions in our work, that we contextualize the definitions of advancing equity into the geographic regions of particular types of industry and those affected more with the economic shutdown that had happened.
Okay, good. Great question in the chat there. It disappeared on me, Nanoko, but basically saying, is there a definition that is used by the state? I don't know if any of our commissioners have a sense of that, or if that's part of the one council's work or any of the other council's work.
Yeah, Paul, good point, and Nanoko, good question. Chris has a whole deck on exactly how you define equity, and he uses a lot of sort of symbolic and other definitions to help get at what exactly it means. I don't know if there is a codified definition in statute per se. In fact, statute tends to be pretty outdated on this stuff. It still uses phrases like minority-led businesses, for example, which isn't that's a language of deficiency that state government doesn't like to use anymore, but it's still on the book. So there's some cleanup to be done on definitions, I think, on the institutional level. But as Chris will define it, there's a whole host of ways that he and his team look at it that I'm sure he'd be happy to share.
Other thoughts, comments?
One of the things I would add here is just, obviously this first part of our work is budget centric, right? We're figuring out how to spend money. And there's a whole host of things that involve systematic changes that could change the equity trajectory of our state that are policy related, right? Just how we run government and what policy changes could be made. And so as we think about what we're doing here, both in this near-term budget recommendation, but also the longer-term work of this council through next June, there's kind of both of those vectors that we can explore. So there's a lot of rich territory here.
Okay. Neil.
Just building on Steve's point, Steve, I think that was a very good, a nice reminder and a really important point. And I'm going to some of the comments people have made today are really sticking with me. And I'm not going to give credit to everybody who said it, but it's like, I've lived in Minnesota now for almost 6 years. Nowhere have I've lived in a lot of places around the country. Is there as much talk about equity and inclusion as there is in Minnesota? And nowhere is the disconnect between that talk and reality as big as it is in Minnesota. And one of the things is, I think clear to everybody is systems operate the way they are designed. And the reason they're so hard to change is because there are a lot of people who benefit from the system as it is. And so, what are we left with? Why is Minnesota not cracked this nut at all? I'm reminded that here's a crude analogy, and maybe this will resonate, maybe not. Think about like the federal government. You go to Washington, D.C., they got this huge budget deficit, and then they set up a commission on what to do about the deficit. And they say, well, we can't touch taxes. We're not going to raise taxes. We can't touch entitlements. We can't touch defense. And you know what you're left with? You're left with crumbs around the edges, little tiny stuff around the edges, because you can't touch any of the things that actually matter. And so this is less about the budget discussion, but Steve, you reminded me when you said longer term policy issues. It'd be great over the course of our work together if we can just really be honest about all the stuff we're not supposed to talk about and say, let's actually go after that. Because for 30 years, we've been talking about all the stuff we're allowed to talk about, which is just playing with crumbs.
I mean, that's one of the reasons I was really intrigued by Marcus's comment. I'm just going to lay it out there. I mean, equity is a divisive word in the modern society. Half of society thinks at least they understand exactly what it's about, is all for whatever, and the other half of society, I've heard all sorts of things about it. A lot of it's equity equals equality equals socialism. You name it, but it's a watch out word. There was a quote from a member of one of the parties last year that basically said equity means you're just giving money to your friends. So it's like, if that's such a loaded word, then I'm really intrigued by going, let's don't get caught in that trap. Let's describe exactly what it is we're seeking to accomplish. And if we can, and maybe that would be more effective than getting hung up on the word.
Juhi, you put your hand up there, I see.
Yeah, I apologize. I had to step away. But I was in looking at the list and the building on successes. I think yes, and I think we really want to take this opportunity to invest in innovation. So I think it's a unique opportunity, like everybody's saying, and we have a system that's already funding certain programs, and it's an opportunity to invest in the future with long-lasting impacts. And we, presumably part of that can only be done with innovation.
I'll just say that we talked about that in our small group, actually, and again, Penny put it, I think, really well. Scaled programs that are rooted or grounded in community that we know work. And part of this came up, and again, Steve, I threw you under the bus a little bit, but I said I'm Steve's best friend and I'm his worst critic, right? We know what works in workforce development, particularly in communities of color, right? We know that culturally specific scaled programs that have cultural context that are tied to employers already, right? Employer partners, employer-driven career pathways strategies. We know that works, right? Yet we spend the bulk of our government dollars, I won't name the program, but going into other streams in employment and training, right? And we continue to nickel and dime the things that we know work, right? And so this is part of what we can't talk about across a number of areas, right? And that is not to say that government isn't an important partner, and particularly this question comes up relative to the government's role in delivering of programs and delivery of strategies. Government's important on lots of those, but this is one of those areas, again, scaled programs that are grounded in communities that work and in fact produce results that business wants, that the economy wants, that employers want. It's not a feel-good thing about your friends. It's about what do we know works. We know what works in several of these areas, childcare, right? We know what works in a lot of different areas. So
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, it's a great point. I'll be brief, but you could not be more right. And it is why we spent a lot of the last session trying to reform the entire workforce development fund of the state to do exactly that, which is to direct money towards what's working and away from what's stale. And I'll tell you, the headwinds are stiff, but that's why we tried to highlight some of those programs in this deck, just to give some food for thought on this, because there are proven models and funding them makes a difference. And there are those who don't want to do it. And I think this group could change that if it's something we want to focus on.
Juhi, is your hand still up? I'm sorry.
No, sorry, thanks.
Okay, all right. We just got just a few minutes left here. Bharti?
Well, maybe in the context of ARPA funds and Steve's point, I will also say that we see a lot of programs where we give a glancing nod of cash to, but we don't ever fully fund it. And then we throw up our hands and like, it didn't work, right? Like, I can't tell you, and particularly when it's investing in issues that could support rural Minnesota or BIPOC communities. So as we are thinking about ARPA funds and some of the things, and I'm not talking necessarily just about the list that the commissioners presented today, but I will say that, like, oftentimes we don't fund things such that they can get the impact that they're suggesting, right? And then we're all like, oh, they don't work. And so I will say maybe part of our examination, or the way that we could think about the ARPA funds, is like, what if we use this one-time money to fund appropriately, right? To sort of see what kind of thing that we could, what is the actual thing? And maybe that also gets to what Juhi's saying about, like, innovation, right? Because actually a lot of innovation would be like, what if we actually fully funded the program to get the result? Because I'll promise you, in 25 years I worked for a nonprofit, I've never seen anything fully funded to the extent that it needs to be in order to make transformational change. And so I just wanted to offer that piece up too. And I think that happens a lot when you are investing, particularly in programs and supports for BIPOC communities, for children and youth, right? For people in Greater Minnesota. So I just wanted to, just a thing to consider.
No, it's a great point. And again, one of the things that I'll say in our small group, one of the things that came up, in fact, was wanting to hear more from the commissioners on what was partially funded, what wasn't funded, and what might be a transformative change. So I think they're just as in that small example, there might be some overlap there. Jody, you had a question there, I think, and then we're going to wrap up.
Just a comment, the last few comments have reminded me that a theme I've heard in our meetings so far is fewer proposals with bigger dollars. It's something we're also doing inside DHS as we look at proposals for next year. And so instead of 60 change pages with a little bit of money in each, I've heard a lot from this group in the several meetings about let's try fewer things and put some real dollars into them.
Great point. So, okay, so the chat has been absolutely going crazy. Good work, folks. I haven't been able to keep track of it, but I know the staff has. Staff's been updating the guiding principles as we've been talking. Lots of good work there. I think my guess is we will pick this up again next week and come back with kind of a refined list. I also, again, I haven't shared this at all with my staff colleagues or with Jeff, but I'm just wondering if there might be, we might pull together even just a small group to do a little bit of writing in between meetings, perhaps in between the next couple of meetings, just as a way of getting some more hands on actual language, especially around this this kind of my concept, and I guess I volunteered myself around a preamble. But also maybe around principles. So again, just want to thank everybody for your work. Jeff, any closing comments at all on your end?
I really appreciate everybody's attention today. I mean, we're getting down to crunch time here, but that was really a helpful session. It seems like we have a pretty good basis for at least the guiding principles, and we'll then segue from that to the next, probably more even difficult task of starting to synthesize the ideas.
All right, good. We will see you next Monday. Thank you much for your time, and have a great week.
Have a good evening, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.